Tonight, let me touch you. That hoarse whisper fell heavy and warm, like fire in the cabin's still air. Just a week before, Lydia had been the woman abandoned at the depot, bearing the scorn of the town. Now she lay in the weathered arms of Elias, the lonely widower who had taken her in. His rough hand brushed back her hair, pressing a trembling yet burning kiss upon her shoulder. His breath, hot against her skin, seemed to burn away every barrier that once stood between them. In ragged breaths and pounding hearts, they gave to each other not just flesh, but the raw longing to be seen, to be loved, to belong. That night, the cabin glowed not only with firelight, but with two bodies joined as one, defying the storm that howled beyond the walls. The wind tore through dry Hollow Valley like a starving beast, carrying shards of snow and white dust. A stagecoach rattled in late, half a day behind schedule. Its wheels crunched against frozen ruts with a sound like breaking bones, as if the wagon itself had grown weary of the long road. Folks in town glanced up, then bent back to their work. They were used to strangers passing through, seldom staying long in this hard land. But when the wooden door swung open, the woman who stepped down made the whole platform still, not from welcome, but from suspicion. Lydia Grant clutched the strap of her worn cloth bag, her frame trembling in the bitter wind. The dark brown travel dress she wore was already old, the hem torn and mud-stained. The bodice had split at one seam, bearing a small gap from the long journey west. Rain-soaked curls clung to her face, her lips cracked and bleeding. Yet in her black eyes there burned something stubborn, like coal glowing beneath snow. The station went quiet for a breath. People whispered, then turned away. A few stares lingered, sharp with contempt. In this town, a colored woman was a rarity, and rarer still one who arrived alone with no kin waiting. A man stepped forward, neat and polished. His wool coat spotless, boots gleaming, hair combed fine in city fashion. Charles Whitmore, banker's son, the man who had written her those letters. Carefully inked promises of a home, a place in the West, a future she could hold on to. Lydia had believed him. She had crossed half the country on the strength of his words. Now, standing before her, his gaze ran quick from her head to her shoes, lingering on the torn hem and the heaviness at her hips. His lips pressed thin, the corner of his mouth curving downward. "No," he said, voice colder than the wind. "You are not what I imagined." The words fell like an axe, severing the last thread of hope. Lydia felt her heart pound against her ribs, but her spine held straight. She had endured too much scorn to let tears show before a crowd. "I crossed half the country because of your promise," she answered, her voice low but steady. Charles only shrugged. For a moment, awkwardness flickered across his face. Then he turned, striding off. His figure slipped into the bank's doorway and vanished, leaving Lydia as though she had been a mistake set down in the wrong place. She stood alone on the platform. The stares returned, curious, mocking, a few laughs spilling from the corner of the street. Wind pressed her thin dress close, baring her body to their eyes. Across the way, another man had not moved on. Elias Carter leaned against a post outside the saloon, dust clinging to his long coat, hat brim shadowing half his face. He stepped forward, favoring his left leg, a limp from some war wound. His face was rough-hewn, beard thick, gray eyes cold as winter. But when those eyes found Lydia, there was a flicker of something else. Not pity, not desire. Silence stretched, filled only by the howl of wind. Lydia gripped her bag tighter, chin lifted high, hiding the tremor in her chest. Then Elias left the saloon porch, each step heavy in the frozen mud. Boots cracked the ground with a dull snap. The townsfolk watched, murmuring. He stopped in front of her. No wasted words, no probing stare, only a broad, calloused hand held out steady. The wind rushed through, whipping Lydia's wet hair across her face. She looked at that hand, a hand that knew work, knew pain, but also knew how to hold fast. Who would reach for a woman the whole town had turned away? Lydia drew in a breath and laid her trembling hand into his. The road out of town stretched long and lonely, wagon wheels jolting over frozen ruts. The sky had turned the color of iron, the breath of Elias's horses puffing white against the dusk. Lydia sat still, hands clasped tight around her worn cloth bag. The wool coat he had handed her hung loose on her shoulders, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke. She pulled it close, hiding her torn dress, clinging to the borrowed warmth. Neither spoke. The wagon creaked and swayed, broken only by the dull grunt Elias made each time he shifted his aching left leg. Lydia glanced at him once, noting how he bore his pain in silence, his gaze fixed on the snow-laden track ahead. By the time the light thinned into shadow, a small cabin appeared at the tree line. Its roof was weathered gray, patched here and there with tin. A lean-to stable stood nearby, wood stacked high under a tarp, smoke curling from the chimney into the darkening sky. Relief eased from Lydia's chest. Whatever else it might be, this place was not as cold as the town's stairs. Elias climbed down first, boots sinking into the hard earth. He took the reins, then came around and offered his hand. His grip was rough, steady. For a moment, Lydia's heart faltered before she pulled back, nodding in thanks instead of words. Inside, heat from the stove spread through the single room. The air smelled of wood smoke and ash. One side held a narrow bed with a wool blanket, the other a table with 2 chairs, a shelf lined with pots. A rifle leaned near the door, a pair of worn boots shoved under the bed. Everything neat, yet marked by solitude. Lydia lingered at the doorway, clutching her bag. Her eyes followed the cracks in the wooden floor, the flicker of firelight stretching both their shadows across the wall. It was safer here than she had felt all day, though unease still pressed her ribs. "You can set your things there," Elias said, his voice low, clipped. She set the bag down. Her hem snagged as she turned, and she stumbled, steadying herself against the table. At that moment, Elias looked up from the hearth. Her hand brushed his arm. The contact was slight, yet it startled them both. Lydia withdrew quickly, lowering her gaze. Elias cleared his throat and fed another log to the fire. From a wooden chest, he brought out a sack of beans and a few potatoes. "We'll eat," he muttered. Lydia hesitated, then moved to the table. The coat draped over her small frame as she reached for the knife. The blade was dull. Her hand slipped. Before she could gasp, Elias caught the handle, his calloused hand over hers. The weight of it was firm, protective. "Slow," he said, his voice gentler. She nodded, her hand trembling as she pulled back. Silence filled the room once more. When the stew was set on the stove, they stood side by side, their shoulders brushed. At first, Lydia thought to step away, but something held her still. The nearness did not shame her. Unlike the eyes in town, Elias's presence carried no judgment. He stirred the beans, she added the potatoes. A plain scent rose, warm and filling. Supper passed without chatter. The scrape of spoons against tin bowls was the only sound. Lydia sat upright, refusing to seem small. Elias ate slowly, his eyes lifting to her now and then, but never for long. Afterward, she gathered the bowls. Her hand touched his shoulder as she passed one to him. Both paused, though no word followed. The fire snapped in the grate. The wind howled through the pines, and between them something faint and steady began to glow. Night drew down. Elias added wood to the fire, pulled a chair near the stove. He gestured toward the bed. "You'll sleep there. I'll keep watch here." Lydia pressed her lips together, not protesting. She laid herself on the unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind lash the trees, the fire crack and pop. Within that rhythm, she felt something new forming, too quiet to name, but enough to ease the weight she had carried across the miles. The first morning in the cabin broke with pale gray light, snow glinting faintly on the pine boughs. Lydia woke to the clatter of movement outside. Elias had been up for hours. She pulled on the oversized coat, stepped onto the porch, and let the cold bite her skin. By the stable, he stacked bales of hay, his motions steady, though his limp betrayed the ache in his left leg. "You'll have to learn if you plan on staying," he said, without turning. Lydia only nodded. She knew nothing of ranch work, yet her dark eyes shone with resolve. Her first task was to spread the hay outside the stalls. The bales were awkward, scratching her arms raw. After only a few trips, her soft hands blistered red. She clenched her jaw, refusing to cry out. Elias noticed, frowning. He handed her a strip of coarse cloth. "Wrap them. It'll help." She froze, then accepted it. Their fingers brushed, just enough to unsettle her chest. Elias turned back to his work as though nothing had passed. Cleaning the stalls was worse. The stench turned her stomach. She gripped the shovel, clumsy strokes splattering her shoes. Elias stood close, gray eyes watchful, yet he spoke no scorn. When her strength gave out, he finished the task without a word. In that silence, Lydia felt a strange lessening of her loneliness. At midday, they walked to the well behind the cabin. Lydia bent low, lowering the bucket into the dark shaft. The coat slid off her shoulders, collar of her dress gaping wider. As she leaned, a glimpse of smooth brown skin caught the light. Elias halted behind her. His gaze lingered, not with crude hunger, but something quieter, restrained, difficult to hide. When Lydia straightened, curls falling into her eyes, she caught him looking. For a breath, the world stilled. She tugged the coat back into place and lifted the water. Elias turned away, clearing his throat. Later, repairing a fence toppled by the wind, he lifted the posts while she steadied the rails. Their backs pressed together against the gusts, breaths mingling in the icy air. No wasted words, only the rhythm of two bodies moving as one. That night, Lydia rubbed her swollen palms, skin split and raw. Elias set a jar of sheep tallow on the table. "Use it," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire. She smeared the ointment over her hands, aware of his glance flickering toward her before turning away again. The space between them was still wide, yet each accidental touch, each glance held too long, each silence weighted heavier than words. A thread had begun to stretch taut between them. The wind howled across the valley. Firelight danced shadows along the cabin walls. Lydia lay down, aching but alive, her lips curling faintly as she remembered Elias's look by the well. He sat in his chair, eyes closed, broad hand resting heavy on his knee, as if holding tight to something unnamed. Out of the harshness, a small fire had begun to burn. That night, the wind in the pines cried like some wild animal's call. The cabin held only the glow of the fire, flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Lydia knelt near the stove, coaxing more wood onto the embers. A shard of coal spat loose, sparks leaping against the hem of her dress. She lurched forward, her heel slipping on the slick boards, body pitching hard. A firm hand closed around her waist and pulled her upright. Lydia looked up, breath ragged, her face inches from Elias's chest. Firelight rose along the breadth of his frame, the smell of smoke and leather clinging to him, warm against the bite of cold air. Her heart hammered. In that moment she noticed something glinting beneath his shirt. As he bent to steady her, a thin chain slipped free. A silver locket, worn and scratched by years, dangled into the light. Lydia's hand, still unsteady, brushed against it. The clasp flipped open with a soft snap. Firelight caught on the small photograph inside. A woman's face, pale and gentle, eyes kind, lips curved in a tender smile. The air in the cabin grew heavy. Elias froze, his hand slipping from her waist as though burned. He stepped back, eyes darkening, gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls. With one swift motion he snapped the locket shut and tucked it beneath his shirt. "I'm sorry," Lydia whispered. Her voice trembled, the weight of her intrusion sinking deep. She had never felt so misplaced. "It's nothing," Elias rasped, the words rough, final. He gripped the back of his chair, shoulders taut as stone. The space between them widened again, silent and raw. Lydia lowered herself near the fire, stretching her hands toward the flames, though her gaze kept sliding to him. He sat unmoving, firelight cutting harsh lines across his weathered face. A cold settled in her chest. Who was the woman in the locket? Whoever she had been, she belonged to Elias in a way Lydia feared she never could. And what place did Lydia have? A stranger scorned by the town, a woman already branded unworthy. Yet when Elias's eyes drifted to her again, the look was different. It wasn't the sharp dismissal of Charles on the depot platform, nor the cruel judgment of townsfolk. It was a gaze weighted with memory, but softened at the edges, as if he saw in Lydia something wholly her own. Lydia's fingers curled tight. She knew she was not yet chosen, not yet anything more than a shadow at his hearth. But for the first time since her long journey west, she no longer felt like a mistake left behind. Outside, the wind still roared. Inside, the fire burned on, fragile, uncertain, yet enough to keep two wounded souls from the dark pressing at their walls. The morning began with the creak of wagon wheels cutting across frozen ground. Elias had told Lydia they would ride into town. She sat bundled in his coat, the familiar scent of pine smoke clinging to its wool. Her hands hid beneath the folds, her chest heavy with dread. When the wagon halted at the square, Elias stepped down first. Lydia followed, and at once the eyes of Dry Hollow fastened on her. No voice spoke loud, yet the whispers carried sharp as pins. Colored woman, and a stray at that. No wonder Charles cast her off. With a body like that, who would keep her? Widower Carter took her in, likely just to fill a hollow bed. Each word stung like nettles on bare skin. Lydia lowered her head and quickened her pace, dress snagging in the cold wind, every movement fodder for scorn. Behind her, Elias walked with his heavy limp, silent but listening. He heard each barb, saw the way her shoulders trembled as if under a weight of stones. They bought flour, salt, little else. No greetings were offered, no neighborly nods. Lydia never once raised her eyes. Only when the wagon rolled beyond the edge of town did she exhale hard, as though breaking free of a noose. That night, the cabin held a stillness that cut deep. Lydia sat on the bed's edge, gaze fixed on the black line of trees outside the window. The fire burned steady, yet the cold pressed in through her chest. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet but unrelenting. She bit her lip to keep from making a sound, shoulders shaking beneath the lamplight. Elias sat in his chair, boot in hand, as if mending it, but his eyes had long since drifted to her narrow back. He saw the tremor, heard the muffled breaths she tried to hide. At length he set the leather aside and stood. His steps fell soft across the floor. "Lydia." His voice was low, halting. "You are beautiful." She startled, turning to him, her eyes red and wet. "It's been years," Elias went on, "since my heart stirred at the sight of someone." Lydia gave a short, bitter laugh and shook her head. "You don't need to comfort me. I know this body, this skin, too plain to be worthy of love." Her voice broke, fingers knotting the quilt tight. Elias did not answer at once. He sat beside her, the bed dipping beneath his weight. His rough hand reached, brushing away her tears, with a gentleness at odds with the scars on his palms. His gray eyes held steady. "No, that is truth. You are beautiful. My heart knows it." Silence thickened. Then Elias leaned closer, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was unsteady, slow, burdened with the years he had held shut his soul. Lydia stiffened, then melted. Tears spilled anew, but not from shame. For the first time, someone had dared to see her differently. He drew her close, arms enclosing her in warmth. Their breaths mingled, firelight painting their forms against the wooden wall. The kiss was not hunger, but communion. Two cast-offs finding shelter in each other when the night deepened. Elias did no more than hold her. Lydia laid her cheek to his chest, listening to the thrum of his heart. Tears clung still to her lashes, but her spirit eased, as though the wind outside had ceased its howling. That night they slept side by side, only an embrace. Yet within that quiet, a flame caught and held, small, steady, destined to rise brighter in the days ahead. Outside, the wind clawed at the pines, but inside the cabin, the fire breathed a golden warmth. Lydia had hung her smoke-damp coat by the door, leaving only a thin cotton nightdress draped over her shoulders. The fabric slipped loose, bearing the smooth curve of her skin, firelight grazing her with a soft and unyielding glow. Her hair fell free, dark curls brushing her collar and arms. She sat before the hearth with an old wooden comb, each slow stroke steadying her after the long day. Behind her, Elias bent over the table, hands busy with the worn strap of a saddle. Yet his gaze strayed again and again, drawn by the line of her back, the bare of her shoulder. In the play of firelight, her face seemed almost luminous, and something taut and aching stirred inside him, like a bowstring drawn too tight. The silence thickened until he set his tools aside. His boots thudded softly on the planks as he crossed the room. Lydia kept her head bowed. but she felt his breath near, his shadow falling over her. A rough hand reached, brushing a strand of hair from her shoulder. The gesture was slow, hesitant, and left her skin bare to the light. His lips touched there, barely a whisper of a kiss, yet enough to send a shiver through her. His voice came low, almost afraid of being overheard by the cabin walls themselves. "Tonight, let me touch you." Lydia turned her face upward. Her dark eyes met his, flames dancing within them. She gave no word, only let her hand slip into his. When his wide, scarred fingers closed over hers, their breaths tangled as if they had already crossed the distance. The space between them vanished. Elias bent, mouth finding hers. The kiss no longer trembled with doubt. It pressed urgent, weighted with all he had held back. Lydia trembled, then clung to him, arms winding around his neck as though to keep him from slipping away. His hand settled firm at her hip, drawing her close. He turned her gently until her back pressed against the table's edge, the world shrinking to heat and breath and heartbeats. "Elias," she murmured, her voice roughened. He answered not with words, but with kisses down her throat, across her shoulder. Each touch burned like flame, and Lydia gripped his hand tighter. The comb slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor, a sound marking the moment the dam broke. Her thin gown slid from her shoulder, falling halfway down her arms. Elias paused, searching her face. She answered by pulling him closer, her lips pressing hard against his. The fire crackled, shadows swayed. Hands clasped, lips joined, their bodies found each other in the quiet frenzy of need. Outside the wind howled, but within they shared all. The ache of rejection, the hunger to be seen, the fragile love just born. No town's scorn reached them. No ghost of the past could break through. When the flames dwindled to embers, they lay beneath the wool blanket, breath slowing. Lydia pressed her cheek to his chest, listening to the deep rhythm of his heart. Tears touched her lashes, not from shame but from knowing she had found at last a place that felt like belonging. Elias held her close, eyes closed, lips moving with words scarcely voiced. "Thank you for coming." The night burned warm with fire and wind, and within its hush, a new beginning was written. News moved faster than the winter wind that scoured the valley. Within days, Dry Hollow buzzed with talk. Lydia Grant had refused to stay under the Whitmore roof. Folks said she was nothing more than a parcel Amos Beard had paid passage for, a bargain gone wrong. And now Elias Carter, the widower who lived alone at the forest's edge, had taken it on himself to keep her. At the saloon, Amos's laughter carried sharp and mean. "She's mine. I paid her fair. No man's gonna steal what I bought." The words traveled quick, reaching the small cabin among the pines. That afternoon, Lydia was drawing water from the well when she heard hoofbeats. Her hands shook, the bucket tipping, spilling icy water across her dress. Up the slope rode a man with a silver star pinned bright on his chest, Deputy Cooper. He swung down, brushed snow from his coat, and started for the porch. Lydia froze on the step, her heart racing. Memories of the stairs and whispers in town crashed back, heavy as stones. Elias stepped from the doorway, his limp marked in each step, but his eyes hard as flint. He stopped square on the porch, shielding Lydia with his frame. "Carter," Cooper said, voice polished but edged with warning. There's word you're keeping a woman who don't rightly belong to you. Amos Beard claims he paid to bring her out from Philadelphia. If that's true, the law sides with him. Lydia's fingers clenched the fabric of her skirt. The word paid cracked through her like a whip. Her whole body trembled, lips too dry to speak. Elias didn't blink. His voice came rough, steady. She belongs to no one. The words struck like a hammer in the cold air. Lydia lifted her eyes, seeing his broad back holding the line, his breath rising white in the wind. Cooper frowned. You know I'm just doing my duty. The town doesn't want trouble. If Amos comes here, I won't be able to hold him back. Elias's jaw set. Then tell him this, he has no claim on her. Something shifted inside Lydia's chest, a weight tearing loose. Simple words, but they cut through years of silence and shame. For the first time, someone had spoken aloud that she was not a possession, not a burden. Cooper exhaled, shrugging. Suit yourself, Carter. But Amos won't let go easy. He mounted, the sound of hooves fading into the snow. Silence returned. Only the wind hissed through the pines. Lydia stood trembling, water pooling at her feet and freezing into glass. Elias turned, his gaze softer now, though his face remained drawn tight. Don't be afraid, he said quietly. She bit her lip and nodded. But after he stepped inside, Lydia lingered on the porch, heart pounding. She knew Amos's threats were no idle bluster. His shadow had already fallen across this cabin. Inside, Elias sat at the table, cloth in hand, polishing the iron of his rifle. Each stroke was slow, deliberate. Lydia stood near the stove, watching his shoulders rise and fall, the weight pressing on him as much as on her. Between them stretched a silence taut as wire, strung with fear. That night, Lydia could not sleep. She lay listening to the wind scrape at the walls, glancing often to where Elias sat by the fire. The gun rested across his knees, the glow of the flames reflecting in his gray eyes. He never closed them. The shadow of Amos had yet to ride back into their lives, but already it lived there, an uninvited guest haunting the cabin's dark corners. The sky hung low that night, heavy as a leaden quilt smothering the pines. The wind had stilled, but the silence that replaced it carried a sharper edge. Lydia sat near the hearth, her fingers brushing the coarse rag Elias had left for her days before, her mind circling back to Cooper's warning. The fire painted Elias's scarred jaw with restless light as he worked the rifle across his lap, each motion unhurried, deliberate. From the distance came the sound of hooves, wheels grinding over snow. Lydia started, the spoon slipping from her hand and clattering against the floorboards. Elias rose in a single motion, limp heavy but sure, gun in hand. Torchlight flickered between the trees, drawing closer. He opened the cabin door. Cold air rushed in. Elias stepped to the porch. Lydia followed, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Amos Beard stood in the yard, draped in a velvet coat that gleamed dark beneath the flames. Polished boots shone where the torchlight struck. Two men flanked him, one with a revolver drawn, the other brandishing a knife. Firelight danced across Amos's smile, turning it cruel. "Carter," Amos called smoothly. "I've come to claim what's mine." Elias lifted the rifle, steel in his eyes. "She's no man's property." "Least of all yours," Amos chuckled, turning his gaze on Lydia. His eyes crawled over her, pausing at her calloused hands, her dark skin, the defiance in her stance. You know I paid your fare. That gives me right enough. Lydia clenched her fists, shoulders trembling, but her voice cut sharp. I am not a parcel. She stepped forward, standing level with Elias. The hired gun sneered, raising his revolver. The air stretched thin, brittle as glass. From inside the cabin the fire cracked, its hiss threading into the frantic beat of Lydia's heart. The shot came quick, but Elias's came quicker. His rifle roared, splitting the night. The gunman screamed, his weapon spinning from his hand as blood poured down his sleeve. Horses shrieked, torches tumbled into the snow, sparks scattering. Amos jerked back, startled, though he forced his mouth into a smile. You'll pay for this, Carter. By then, Lydia had drawn the kitchen knife she'd hidden in her apron. She stepped forward, hand shaking, but voice steady. I do not belong to you. I do not belong to anyone. The blade glinted in the red torchlight, her eyes fierce and unyielding. Amos faltered. Words caught in his throat as he faced her. It was not the gaze of the abandoned woman on the depot platform that met his, but the gaze of one who had claimed her own fate. The wounded man groaned in the snow. The other hesitated, eyes darting between Elias's rifle and Lydia's burning stare. Amos spat into the snow, his face pale. This isn't over. He wheeled his horse, jerked his head, and his men followed, one leaving a trail of blood across the frozen ground. The night grew quiet again. Lydia looked down, realizing her hand was locked tight around the knife, her fingers numb. Elias moved to her side, his large hand covering hers, pressing it gently downward. Enough, he said, rough but steady. She looked up. His gray eyes still carried vigilance, yet when they met hers, they softened with respect and pride. The knife slipped from her hand, landing in the snow with a dull thud. Breath shuddered from her chest. She let herself fall into his arms, trembling. The wind cut sharp through the trees, but the cabin's warmth spilled outward, wrapping them in its glow. Amos had left, but his shadow lingered, bitter as an open wound. Yet that night, Lydia knew she had raised her voice, broken the chain, and Elias, with a single shot, had declared it to the frozen valley. She belonged to no man but herself. The night Amos rode away, snow thickened over the valley, blanketing the pines in silence. Inside the cabin, Lydia did not close her eyes once. Her body still trembled with the memory of torches and gunfire. Elias sat near the hearth, rifle within reach, but his face had turned pale, his hand gripping tight around his left leg. When Lydia drew close, she saw the swelling beneath his trouser leg, blood seeping through worn cloth. Fear of Amos ebbed for the moment, replaced by a sharper dread. Fear of losing the man who had stood unflinching before her. Let me look. Her voice shook, but her tone carried no doubt. Elias tried to wave her off, but her steady gaze silenced him. She guided him to the bed, slow step after slow step, his legs stiff beneath him. When he sat down, his breath came heavy, sweat beading along his temple. Lydia pulled off his boot, peeled back damp cloth to reveal the old scar, inflamed and angry red. You've pushed too hard, she whispered, half scolding. He shut his eyes, saying nothing. His rough hand trembled as he pressed it to the quilt, as though clinging to silence. Lydia fetched a basin of warmed water and a clean rag. She knelt, washing away blood and grit, her fingers gentle against calloused skin. Elias flinched once, uncertain whether from pain or from the warmth of her touch. It must be cleaned. And you need rest, the firelight gilded her face, dark eyes shining with quiet resolve. Elias opened his own and found himself staring, not at the wound, nor the pain, but at the tenderness carved into her features. When her curls brushed against his cheek as she bent lower, he almost reached to move them aside. He stopped himself, hand falling back to the quilt. Lydia lifted her head, lips curving faintly, then urged him upright. You should bathe. It will ease you. He frowned, meaning to argue, but the weight in his leg left him no strength. She supported him toward the small washroom, where water steamed faintly in a wooden tub. Elias sank onto the stool, chest rising and falling. Lydia knelt once more, cloth in hand, drawing it across his broad shoulder, tracing the scars that crossed his chest like maps of a life carved in hardship. The firelight caught every line. The cabin was so still that only the drip of water and Lydia's heartbeat filled the air. She passed the rag slowly along his skin, her fingers brushing now and then, each touch leaving heat in its wake. Elias held himself rigid, eyes dark, enduring not only the ache in his body, but the storm she stirred inside him. When she reached behind him, her hair brushed the bare of his back, soft as velvet. Elias let out a low breath, eyes closing. You can lean on me, Lydia whispered. He opened his eyes. The look he found in hers was not the timid glance of a woman abandoned on a station platform. It was steady, strong, rooted in a choice she had already made. He said nothing, only laid his scarred hand over hers as she wrung the cloth on. A simple touch, but it carried the weight of something long withheld, almost confessed. They did not move beyond it. Yet when she finished, draped a wool blanket around his shoulders, and led him back to bed. The air inside the cabin had shifted. It was no longer merely shelter from storm or shadow. It had become a place where wounds and breaths and silences bound them closer. Lydia sat by his side, her hand still resting lightly against his arm. Elias managed a smile, rare and awkward, but true. Thank you. She shook her head, voice sure. We stood against him together. From now on, you are not alone. That night, with the wind rushing the trees, Elias drifted into sleep, his wound tended and his heart steadied. Lydia kept watch beside him, her gaze fixed on his face. The tears she had once shed had dried. What remained was quiet warmth and the unspoken certainty that neither of them would stand alone again. After the night of blood and fire, the cabin sank into a hush that lasted for days. Elias's wound forced him to rest more than he liked, yet life pressed on. Lydia rose with the pale light, stirred the fire, hauled water from the well, cleaned the stalls, her work careful, steady. At first Elias only watched from the porch, cane in hand, his gaze weighing every step she took. He feared she might falter, as so many had before when they found this land too hard to bear. But day after day, she did not falter. The sun darkened her skin, blisters turned to calluses, and her hands grew strong. Once she struggled beneath a sack of grain nearly twice her size. Her steps wavered, the load threatening to topple her. Elias shifted forward on his cane, ready to rise. But before he could move, Lydia pulled the strap tighter, drew a breath, and lifted it again. The bag landed square where it was needed, dust curling into the dawn. She wiped her brow, lifted her chin toward him, eyes bright with defiance, and for the first time in years, Elias laughed. The sound was short, rough, but it lit his face, breaking through the shadow that had long lived there. "You laughed," Lydia said, both surprised and teasing. He nodded once, the corner of his mouth still lifted. "You made me forget the ache in this leg." They stood in silence a long moment, until Lydia's own laughter spilled out, clear as the morning air. It carried across the yard, and Elias found himself wishing the sound would never leave. The days that followed fell into rhythm. They worked side by side as though it had always been so. Elias showed her how to brace a post, to bind timber against the wind. She learned fast, sometimes adding her own small ways. One afternoon, setting fence posts behind the stable, she collapsed into the snow, hair damp with sweat, laughing as she said, "At least this fence won't fall on the horses." Elias stood above her, leaning on his cane, watching her grin. Pride rose in him, quiet but fierce. Evenings they sat on the porch together, backs against the wall, watching the fog roll through the trees. Elias spoke little, and Lydia asked little. Their silence was no longer heavy. It was the silence of two who had found in each other a place to rest. One afternoon, as Lydia carried water from the well, the sun struck her, turning sweat at her throat into sparks of light. When she looked up, she found Elias watching from the porch. This time he did not look away. His eyes held steady, warm, and sure, as though trust itself had taken root in him. She faltered, then smiled. The faint curve of her lips lit her whole face, and Elias felt his heart stumble, a strange, long-forgotten rhythm. That night, as the fire dimmed, Lydia whispered, half to herself, "It feels like we've rebuilt this house together." Elias stared at the rafters, shadows dancing across the beams. Then he turned, placed his rough hand gently over hers. A rare smile touched him. "Aye, and this time, no one will tear it down." Morning spread soft across the pines, casting gold over the yard. In that light, something had settled firm between them. It was no longer duty nor pity. It was trust, bound fast, as steady as the land beneath their feet. That evening the valley glowed beneath a golden veil, sunlight spilling like silk across the slopes. A breeze stirred through the pines, carrying the resin's sharp scent and the faint sweetness of dry grass. Under the porch roof, Lydia stacked bundles of firewood. Her hands were roughened now, sticky with pitch, but each motion was firm, practiced. Her hair, tied loosely, had fallen damp with sweat against her neck. The last light bronzed her skin, burnishing her as though forged from copper. Elias stood nearby, leaning against his cane, silent as he watched. He let his eyes follow every gesture of the woman who had turned his lonely cabin into a home. His heart tightened. For years he had lived hollow, weighed down by ghosts, certain his days were already spent. Yet, as he saw Lydia laugh softly at a bundle that slipped and struck her foot, he understood. Life could still begin again. "Lydia," he said, voice roughened. She looked up, her dark eyes bright in the evening glow. Slowly, Elias stepped closer, each limp deliberate, his hand sliding into the pocket of his worn coat. When he stopped before her, a small wooden box rested in his palm. Her brows furrowed with surprise. Elias lifted the lid. Inside lay a simple silver band, smooth, plain, unadorned. No carved pattern, no stone, only a circle of metal that caught the dying sun with honest light. Drawing a breath, Elias forced himself down onto one knee. Pain shot through his leg, his body trembling, sweat breaking along his brow. But he did not stop. His face clenched with strain, yet his gray eyes burned with a clarity she had never seen. "I have nothing fine to give," he said, voice ragged yet steady. "Only this silver ring and the rest of my days. If you'll have me—" "Stay at my side," Lydia froze. The bundle slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud on the porch. She raised a hand to her mouth, tears spilling as she beheld the proud, wounded man bowed before her, bearing his pain to kneel. "Elias!" Her voice faltered, trembling. He reached for her hand, his large fingers enclosing her smaller ones. "You came here and made me believe I could still live, still love. I don't want another day without you." Lydia sank to her knees opposite him. Tears streaked her cheeks, yet her lips quivered into a smile. "I once thought no one would ever see me as anything but a burden. But you—" Her breath broke, her hand extended. Elias slid the band onto her finger. The silver circled her dark skin, gleaming as though it had always belonged there, a quiet seal of permanence. She wept openly now, tears falling onto his hand, but within them was joy. She nodded fiercely. "Yes, I will." A long breath escaped Elias, as if he had set down years of weight. His eyes blurred in the glow of sunset. He clasped her hand tighter, holding fast to the warmth flowing through him. They sat together on the porch, fingers intertwined. Before them the sun sank behind the Saint-Saumon ridges, painting the sky in bronze and fire. The last rays crowned Lydia's hair, casting her in a light both fierce and tender, as if carved from shadow and gold. Elias rarely smiled, but now his mouth curved in a true smile, unguarded, filled with relief and hope. Lydia rested her head against his shoulder, tears still glistening, yet her lips curved in quiet radiance. "You know," Elias murmured, voice unsteady, "I never thought I'd see this day." "A day I could trust again," Lydia whispered back, eyes closed, fingers squeezing his, "and I never thought I would be chosen." Evening wind swept through, carrying pine resin and damp earth into the cabin. They needed no grand vows. A silver ring, a nod, a hand held tight beneath the falling sun. That was enough to bind two lives. When the last light faded, the valley sank into shadow. But for Lydia and Elias, another kind of light had been kindled, steady, enduring, shining as quietly as the band of silver on her hand. Spring came at last, stripping away the heavy cloak of winter. Around the cabin, the pines shimmered with tender green. The valley floor softened into carpets of fresh grass. The frozen stream broke loose, tumbling over rocks with a voice clear and bright after months of silence. Amid this awakening, Lydia discovered her own quiet secret. Mornings left her weary, her hands lingering unconsciously at her belly, and her eyes carried a light Elias had never seen before. When she told him, words soft as a prayer, he fell silent. His broad hand trembled as he placed it over hers. The gray eyes that had so long borne shadows brimmed, and then he smiled, awkward, hesitant, but brighter than the sun beyond the door. From that day, the cabin changed. No longer a hermit's refuge, no longer a shelter for the discarded. It became a home. Two cups rested together on the shelf. Two pairs of boots, one broad, one smaller, stood muddied from the same path. Bowls were never set for one. And soon, the cries of new life would echo within its walls. Elias chopped more wood, raised sturdier rails for the stable. At times he paused mid-task, palm pressed gently to Lydia's swelling stomach, as though to assure himself the miracle was real. Lydia still worked, but he never let her bear heavy loads again. He carried the buckets, hauled the grain, mended the fences. The scars on his legs still ached with the weather, yet he endured with a smile, for now he labored not just for himself. They spoke little of the town. Dry Hollow still whispered, still sneered, but none of it mattered anymore. Each dawn, when Lydia opened the cabin door to breathe in the scent of wet earth and wildflowers, she felt certain this was the world that belonged to them. A life built with sweat, with tears, with a love that asked no witness but their own. One afternoon, Lydia sat on the porch, mending one of Elias's worn shirts. He sat beside her, sharpening a hunting knife dulled by years of use. The spring wind tugged at her skirt. The sun spread long shadows across the yard. In their silence there was no strain, only the peace of two who had endured storm and fire and come through together. That night, curled near the hearth, Lydia rested her head on Elias's shoulder and whispered, "Our child will grow up not in scorn, but in love." Elias tightened his grip on her hand, closing his eyes as old grief slipped further away. For the first time in many years, he slept deep and dreamless. Days passed. The sky cleared wider, her belly grew rounder. Elias built a wooden cradle, rough-hewn, uneven in its carving, but strong. He placed it by their bed, and each night he laid his hand upon it, imagining the voice soon to fill the cabin. Lydia watched, tears on her cheeks, yet they were gentle tears, like spring rain. When the wildflowers bloomed across the valley, they sat together on the porch steps. The wind carried the scent of earth. The sunset washed the land in fire. Their hands, laced tight, the silver band on Lydia's finger glinting in the fading light. "In this harsh land," Elias said, voice low but firm, "two souls the world cast aside have found their worth in each other." Lydia nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder, her eyes bright with tomorrow. "And together, we've built a legacy of love." The little cabin at the forest's edge glowed with a light not born of sun or flame, but of two scarred hearts that now beat steady in unison. Spring drifted over the valley, soft and certain, and with it Lydia's belly grew rounder by the week. At first the changes were subtle, an early sickness in the mornings, a sudden weariness that left her breathless. Elias noticed each detail. He would stop his work mid-stroke, eyes narrowing with worry, until she laughed and told him she was fine. Only then would he release his breath, though his calloused hands lingered close, ready to steady her should her step falter. The cabin itself began to alter with them. It was no longer just a refuge of wood and stone. It began to wear the shape of a family. On the shelf above the hearth sat two wooden mugs, scarred from years of use, and beside them Elias began to carve a third. The little cup, small enough to fit in his broad palm, bore no polish, but Lydia ran her fingers along its rim as if it were treasure. By the bedside stood the wooden cradle Elias had fashioned. What began as a rough box, plain and square, he sanded until smooth, and etched with simple symbols, the rising sun, a pine bough, a pair of wings. Lydia often sat with her hand on her belly, eyes on that cradle, imagining the wails of a child echoing inside it. On stormy nights, when the wind clawed at the shutters, Lydia would lie awake listening to the small thunder of life within her. She whispered to Elias in the glow of the embers, "Do you think the child will look like you or me?" Elias turned, eyes silver in the flicker, and answered, "Like you." Strong and beautiful in a way no one can deny. By summer, Elias had taken on nearly every burden. He fetched the water, split the logs, mended the fences, each task costing his aching leg, but he never let her shoulder it. Lydia saw the strain, though he hid it, and she answered in kind. Hearty stews left simmering, shirts patched firm, the small mercies of care returned. They found comfort in the little things. A brush of hands when passing a bowl, a glance across the hearth that needed no words. When her belly grew heavier, Elias set another chair on the porch so she could rest in the evening light while he cooked. There she would sit, hair loosed in the breeze, one hand curved over her womb, while he limped across the yard with kindling in his arms. That sight, her quiet strength, the promise of new life beneath her hand, etched itself into his heart more deeply than any scar. One evening, as the sky blazed crimson, Lydia seized his hand and pressed it to her belly. He froze, then felt it, the faint ripple of a kick beneath his palm. His eyes, long accustomed to grief, blurred with tears. He bent low, lips trembling, whispering words that never formed, then kissed the swell of her stomach. "Our child," he murmured. Lydia nodded, tears slipping into her smile. The day of birth came with a storm. Rain hammered the roof, thunder splitting the mountains. Lydia's cries mingled with the roar of heaven, sweat streaming from her hair. Elias, clumsy with fear, fetched water, laid clean cloths, gripped her hand through every wave of pain. "You're not alone," he whispered hoarsely. "Never again will you be alone." Hours dragged, until at last the sharp cry of a newborn cut the storm in two. Lydia collapsed, tears and laughter mingling as Elias laid the child in her arms. A boy, his skin warm brown, tiny hands grasping at air. Lydia wept openly, clutching him to her breast. Elias's hands shook as he brushed her damp hair aside, then bent to gaze at his son. "Gabriel," he said, voice breaking, "a name for an angel who found his way to us." The cabin that had once echoed with silence now rang with new sounds. Midnight cries, soft coos, the gurgling laugh of an infant. Elias learned to swaddle clumsily, to rock the child against his broad chest, to change him with fingers rough but tender. Lydia laughed softly each time she watched him bend, shoulders hunched, his big hands cradling Gabriel as if he were glass. Some nights, when Gabriel slept in his cradle, Elias sat outside, cane propped against the wall, watching the moon silver the valley. Behind him, the soft rhythm of Lydia and the child's breathing reached his ears. The loneliness that had shadowed him for years was gone. In its place lived the fragile, fierce music of belonging. Lydia, too, transformed. She no longer carried the stoop of shame she once bore stepping off the train. She stood straight now, a wife and a mother, eyes steady and proud. Each time she held Gabriel, she remembered the jeers she had suffered, and vowed, "My son will grow in love, not scorn." Seasons shifted. Gabriel grew into a boy with bare feet stained by soil, laughter tumbling through the yard. Elias, though slowed by his leg, chased him clumsily, pretending to lose every race. Lydia stood by, her heart swelling at the sight. her men rough and gentle, filling the valley with joy. Inside the cabin, the evidence of growth spread. The mugs on the shelf became 4 when Lydia carved one herself for Gabriel. By the door, 2 pairs of boots became 4. Elias's broad pair, Lydia's smaller ones, and Gabriel's tiny shoes muddied from play. Dry Hollow remained the same, its whispers unchanged. But it no longer mattered. No one in the town could define them now. Their worth was carved in wood and laughter, in calloused hands and steady love. One autumn afternoon, when the valley burned with gold leaves, Elias sat with Lydia on the porch, Gabriel tumbling in the grass at their feet. The man who had lived half a life in silence put his arm around the woman who had given him a future. And in the hush of falling leaves, he said, "In this harsh land, 2 who were cast aside found their worth in each other and built a legacy of love." Lydia leaned into him, eyes bright with tears and joy. Gabriel's laughter rose, carrying through the hills, as though sealing the vow his parents had already made with their lives. The cabin that once sheltered emptiness now pulsed with life. It stood not just as timber and stone, but as a monument of renewal, proof that love, even scarred and late blooming, could take root in the hardest soil and bear fruit for generations yet to come. The second winter after Gabriel's birth settled hard over Dry Hollow, but the cabin did not know the same silence it once had. Where once the nights stretched empty and cold, now the air trembled with the cries of a child, with the murmur of a mother's lullaby, with the deep, steady hum of a father watching. Lydia rocked Gabriel against her chest, voice low and tender. Elias sat close to the hearth, his eyes softened every time they fell upon his wife and son. His legs still ached with the weather, but the burden felt lighter. In his heart rose a strength he had not known in years. By day, life carried a rhythm of simple labors. Elias hauled wood, fetched water, tended the livestock. Lydia mended clothes, kept the garden, and watched over the boy. Often she stood on the porch, Gabriel balanced on her hip, and saw Elias kneel awkwardly in the yard, coaxing the child to crawl across the rough boards. Gabriel's laugh rang bright each time his father caught him. Lydia's throat tightened at the sight. She thought of Philadelphia, of the cold stares and cruel words, and marveled at how far she had come. To stand here, arms full of love she once thought forever denied. The boy grew, first to crawl, then to stumble into steps across the packed earth. He fell often, but rose each time. Elias, limping, never failed to be there, his broad hands lifting the boy upright. Lydia watched, joy and ache mingling, for she knew the toll it took on her husband's injured leg. One afternoon, Gabriel ran too quick, striking his head on the fence post. His wails filled the yard. Lydia rushed to hold him, tears springing as she kissed the bruise. Elias pressed his hand gently to the child's head, then looked at her and said softly, "Do not fear. He is strong, like you." She raised her gaze to his, and in those gray eyes she saw no longer the shadows of loss, but the steady flame of a father who had found his purpose. So the seasons turned. Spring brought planting, summer the harvest, autumn the chopping of wood, and winter the glow of the hearth. The cabin was no longer a refuge for 2 exiles. It had become a home with the laughter of a child. Gabriel knew nothing of scorn. He grew in love, in warmth. His smile was Lydia's, bright and unyielding, but his quiet gaze carried Elias's depth. He perched on his father's knee, listening as Elias spoke of the forest, of deer trails and the war that had left his body scarred. Lydia sat nearby with her sewing, raising her eyes now and again, her heart swelling with gratitude. When Lydia carried Gabriel into Dry Hollow for supplies, the whispers still trailed her. Eyes still lingered, voices still muttered, yet she no longer bent her head. Elias walked beside her, his limp steady, his shoulders square. Gabriel rested in her arms. For the first time, she felt taller than the town itself. Once, at the market, an old woman studied the boy for a long while, then smiled faintly. "A handsome child," she said. "He favors his father." Lydia's breath caught at the gentleness in that voice. For the first time, a face from the town met hers without malice. She smiled back, her heart lifting. Perhaps not all voices were cruel. Perhaps some saw what she now knew to be true, that their family needed no one's approval but their own. That autumn, Elias rose before dawn to craft something new. With rough-hewn boards and thick rope, he built a small swing beneath the pines. When Lydia came out with Gabriel, Elias nodded shyly toward it. "For him," he muttered, "to have a place to play." She set the boy upon it, and his laughter rang as Elias pushed gently. Lydia pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling at the simple joy of it. It was more than a swing. It was proof Elias had opened himself fully, had left the chains of grief behind. She stepped to him, wrapped her arms around his back, whispering, "Thank you." He covered her hands with his own, saying nothing more. Winter nights found the three of them gathered by the fire. Gabriel drowsed in Lydia's lap, his eyes heavy while Elias strummed clumsy chords upon an old guitar. The tune was rough, but warm, and Lydia's soft voice joined, weaving melody with flame. Elias looked at her then, her face aglow and knew peace for the first time in decades. One evening she whispered, "Someday our son will tell this story, that his parents found each other in a harsh land and built a family from nothing." Elias nodded, stroking her hair, his eyes bright with quiet resolve. Years passed. Gabriel grew tall and sturdy, racing through the woods, clambering onto horses, his laughter chasing the valley wind. Each fall, Elias guided him with patient hands. Each stumble was met not with shame, but encouragement. Lydia saw in her son not only her own courage, but the strength Elias had given him. The cabin expanded with them. A new shed, a larger garden, the crowing of chickens at dawn. On the kitchen shelf, 3 old mugs now stood beside a 4th carved larger for Gabriel. At the doorway, 4 pairs of boots lined the wall, 2 broad, 1 smaller, and a boy's shoes muddied from play. Dry Hollow still whispered, but its voices could not pierce the life they had built. Their worth was measured not by the town, but by each other. One evening, the sun sank in a blaze of red. Lydia stood on the porch, Gabriel tumbling in the yard, Elias's arm draped across her shoulders. The forest stretched into the horizon, shadow meeting sky. She whispered, "In this harsh land, 2 cast aside found their worth and built a legacy of love." Elias clasped her hand, his gray eyes shining in the dying light. Gabriel looked up from the yard, his grin wide, his laughter carrying like a promise. The cabin, once silent, now stood as proof of what could be rebuilt from ruin. Not merely walls of timber and stone, but a monument to renewal. a place where scars turned into strength, where tenderness survived the storm, where a legacy was not wealth or land, but love itself. And perhaps in the hush of the evening wind, one could almost hear the land itself whisper back. They had endured, not by cruelty, not by pride, but by kindness, by hope, by holding on to one another. For what is it we seek, if not the same? A place where judgments fall away, where eyes do not pierce but accept, where a hand in the dark steadies our steps. For Elias and Lydia, that place was not Dry Hollow, nor any city, but the cabin by the woods, where wind and laughter mingled, where old wounds became witness to healing, where a legacy of love took root. Years may weather the timbers, years may scatter the voices of the town, but the truth remains. A man once broken, and a woman once rejected, had carved from stone and snow a hearth that would outlast them. And if, in your own twilight years, you remember a gaze that once stirred your heart, a hand that steadied you, a smile that carried you through half a lifetime, then you too know what it is to leave behind such a legacy. So if this story stirs a memory in you, share it. Let the generations to come see that love is never beyond reach. And if you wish to keep hearing these Wild West love stories, tales where love blooms between storms and hardships, then like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Your voices keep the fire alive, so we may keep telling these tales of tenderness and endurance. For love, even late, is still the finest gift the world grants us. And if, in the dusk of our years, we still have a hand to hold and a home to return to, then surely that is the legacy of love we leave behind.